Moses' words seemed just as credible as Dylan's, but despite that, his account would get little attention in the media. Part of that was because he published it on his own blog. Soon-Yi's account, on the other hand, was published in New York Magazine in an article written by the journalist Daphne Merkin. For the first time, the public learned about Soon-Yi's origins. She remembers growing up in Seoul. She was poor, living with a single mother in a bare apartment with a concrete backyard. She remembers running away from home and living on the street and being so hungry that she tried to eat a bar of soap. One day, she was staring through the window of a bakery when a woman noticed her and bought her something to eat. The lady started asking her questions, realized she was homeless, and took Soon-Yi to the police station where the officers found her an orphanage. She remembers being happy at that orphanage. Soon-Yi also recalls Mia's obsession with recording her children. She didn't just record Dylan, she tried to get Soon-Yi to tell a false narrative of her birth mother on videotape. She wanted Soon-Yi to say her mother was a prostitute who used to beat her. But unlike Dylan, Soon-Yi refused. Soon-Yi's origin story was also referenced in the 1992 Vanity Fair article. According to Maureen Orth, Soon-Yi's birth mother was a violent Korean prostitute who made Soon-Yi kneel in the doorway while she slammed her head with the door. This woman would later disappear and left Soon-Yi on the streets. Recall that in the Guardian article, Mia said Soon-Yi was captured by the authorities. In Mia's desired story, Soon-Yi was violently beaten by a Korean prostitute who then abandoned her until she was captured. But according to Soon-Yi, she was helped by a kind woman, a concerned citizen, who fed her and took her to the police station, and they in turn found her a happy home in the orphanage. You get a much different picture of Soon-Yi's origins, as well as Korean society, depending on which narrative you believe. Who gets to own their own story? Soon-Yi also recalls Mia using her and Lark as domestic servants. This was corroborated by other observers who said Lark was treated like a scullery maid. According to the article, Mia couldn't be bothered with chores. While she spent her time ordering from catalogs, rearranging furniture, and talking to her friends on the phone, Lark and Soon-Yi did all of the housework. They did the grocery shopping, picked up the kids from school, cooked, cleaned the bathroom, did the dishes, did the sweeping, ironed the sheets. Then there was the abuse. According to Soon-Yi, Mia slapped her, beat her with a brush, called her stupid and moronic, threw a large porcelain object at her head. Mia used to hang her upside down because she thought it would help her intelligence. Soon-Yi grew up realizing that she couldn't rely on her mother. In 11th grade, when she broke her ankle, she never told Mia about it because she feared Mia's anger. It was not in my vocabulary to call her for help ever. According to Soon-Yi, Mia could be domineering and abusive, but also hands-off and neglectful. Soon-Yi was disparaged or ignored. She said Mia had no maternal instincts from the get-go. They were like oil and water. She says Mia never taught her anything about tampons, bras, or makeup, and Mia never took her on any college tours. Recall Mia spent 3 hours driving Ronan every day. What do we make of Soon-Yi and Moses' account? From other quotes, we know that Dylan, Ronan, and the Vanity Fair articles insist that the children were treated great.
They all said that they were very proud to be part of that family, that they considered themselves cool and unique.
Yet, Moses and Soon-Yi paint a picture of abuse, humiliation, gaslighting, and living in constant fear of their mother's volatile rage. Let's entertain the possibility that both narratives are sincere. Dylan and Ronan were younger than Soon-Yi, Lark, Moses, Thaddeus, and Tam. Is it possible that Mia's parenting skills improved with age? There's an oft-stated wisdom that the oldest children take the brunt of their parents' bad parenting. This theory doesn't seem to hold up because older children, like Fletcher, Sasha, and Matthew, do appear to have been decently taken care of. They spoke highly of their mother in the Vanity Fair articles. Instead, a more likely theory is what Monica Thompson and Jane Reed Martin observe, that some of these kids are treated better than others, and it's not based on age. Soon-Yi tells us, there was a hierarchy, she didn't try to hide it, and Fletcher was the star, the golden child. Mia always valued intelligence and also looks, blonde hair and blue eyes. All of the abuses in Moses and Soon-Yi's accounts were only committed against the Asian kids. It's hard to draw any other conclusion. Mia simply treated the white children better than the Asian ones. The Asian children dealt with neglect and abuse. They had to deal with the drudgery of endless housework. They were treated like servants. They had to cook and clean and take care of the other kids. They were berated, yelled at. They were told they were moronic, stupid, and liars. They were made to get naked and humiliated in front of their siblings. They didn't get college tours. They were slapped around, hit on their chest, dragged down staircases, and locked in outdoor sheds. They had objects thrown at them. They were emotionally neglected. Mia yelled at them and fought with them and drove them to suicide. Meanwhile, the white children didn't have to do the housework. They got their mother's investment in their education. They got child therapists to attend to their mental well-being. They got driven by Mia to college every day. They weren't forced to strip naked and be gawked at by their other siblings. They weren't humiliated. They got flown around the world. They got easy internships working for UNICEF. In short, the white kids got their mother's love and encouragement, while the Asian kids got her anger, her need for free labor, her beatings, her neglect. Soon Yi's account is consistent with Moses' account and the testimony provided by other neutral observers from the custody battle. Her account seems just as credible as Dylan's, but as you can imagine, journalists and bloggers didn't like it at all. They simultaneously criticized the article while ignoring Soon Yi's words completely. Patrick Coleman, writing for Fatherly, tells us we can essentially ignore Soon Yi because Woody Allen is still a creep. He writes there's nothing in Previn's account to convince anyone that Allen isn't an opportunistic predator who groomed a young girl into a disconcertingly young wife. Except there is. Soon Yi tells us they didn't begin dating until after September 1991. She was 20, a psychology major in college. These journalists seem unable to focus on Soon Yi's words. Coleman spends more of the article writing about Woody. Christina Cauterucci, writing for Slate, makes the same assessment. Ironically, she claims that the piece is a failed attempt to center Soon Yi's own narrative, but then she herself refuses to center Soon Yi's narrative at all. Not once does she even reference the abuses that Soon Yi claims to have suffered. When she does focus on Soon Yi's actual words, she does so only to attack her memory of events, but ignores Soon Yi's struggles, her life as a runaway, her life as an orphan, living as an immigrant under a domineering mother who humiliated her and beat her. And most significantly, Cauterucci makes no reference to the fact that Soon Yi is a survivor of abuse. Instead of responding to Soon Yi's claims of abuse, Cauterucci dismisses her completely by implying Soon Yi is a puppet of Woody Allen. However, her testimony is consistent with Moses' account, so I suppose in Cauterucci's mind, this makes Moses a puppet too. The abuses are also corroborated by Monica Thompson, who witnessed some of the abuse firsthand. Perhaps she too is a puppet. Nicole Clark, writing for Vice, makes a similar assessment. She says the New York story is framed around Soon Yi's victimization, but then she mostly ignores the seriousness of Soon Yi's abuses. At least Clark acknowledges in one paragraph the abuses Soon Yi suffered, but she characterizes Soon Yi's suffering as a wash of he said, she said. But that's not true. Soon Yi's account is corroborated by Moses and is consistent with other neutral observers and the facts from the custody battle. This is not he said, she said. This is corroborated testimony and consistent with known facts. Clark dismisses Soon Yi's suffering altogether, calling her experience anti-Me Too. Laura June, writing for The Outline, calls Soon Yi's perspective warped. She puts profile in quotes as if it's fake news. She says there's 500 things wrong with the interview, but doesn't point out a single factual error. Then she commits a factual error herself. Allen married his stepdaughter. This is not true. She reduces Soon Yi to a 47-year-old woman who has made some mistakes, but Soon Yi hasn't made any mistakes, and she has no major regrets. She does regret how Mia found out about the relationship because it was hurtful to Mia, but she has zero regrets about choosing to be with Woody Allen. June refers to Soon Yi as an orphan child of uncertain origins and an easy target, but the article clearly states that she's from Seoul, Korea, and Soon Yi doesn't seem like an easy target. She seems like a sane woman who speaks coherent English and is of sound mind and body. This journalist is simply relying on the same stereotype that Maureen Orth used in the Vanity Fair article. They want to paint Soon Yi as a naive foreigner, easily manipulated, in other words, an empty-headed puppet. This blogger says she sympathizes with Soon Yi, but it's an odd form of sympathy because she ignores Soon Yi's actual words completely. Then she disparages her by implying she may be stupid, or simply bad, whatever bad means, for defending Woody. She infers Soon Yi is loyal, not logical. In other words, she's a puppet. Who needs that kind of sympathy? In my definition, having sympathy for someone means listening to what they have to say and taking their words seriously. Laura June disparages the entire article by calling it a weak attempt to let Soon Yi speak. But the fact is, it's the only attempt to let Soon Yi speak in over 20 years. Recall the 1992 Vanity Fair articles criticized Soon Yi mercilessly, but never allowed her to speak directly. June writes, Soon-Yi gets a larger share of my sympathy than other women doing the dirty work of dirty men because she was taken advantage of, whether she knows it or can own up to it. Laura June implies that Soon-Yi is too dumb to know she was taken advantage of, and that she cannot own up to it. But Soon-Yi does know she was taken advantage of. She just told us she was a victim of abuse, and she did own up to it. She told us exactly how Mia abused and took advantage of her. When she was a child, Mia treated her like free labor, an extra domestic servant. Mia argued and ruled with rage. She lived in fear of Mia's anger to the point that she couldn't even tell her mother when she broke her ankle. Mia beat her with a brush, slapped her around. Mia threw things at her head. Mia humiliated her for learning English too slowly. She called her dumb and moronic. It seems like Laura June didn't even read the article. She says Soon-Yi's own words doesn't really tell us very much about Soon-Yi Previn as a person. And I suppose that's a matter of perspective. Laura June didn't learn very much, but it's the first time we learn about Soon-Yi's origins and what life was like for her before and after Mia's home. We learned that she wasn't born from a prostitute who beat her, that she was in fact a runaway, who later tried looking for her birth mother. We also learned that she was relatively scrappy, and that she was happy living in the orphanage. She wasn't saved, she was plucked. Perhaps most significantly, we learned that Soon-Yi is a survivor of abuse, and that she speaks cogent English. Perhaps she is simply resilient, and not the dumb girl that Mia Farrow and Maureen Orth made her out to be. I'll give these writers credit for their lovely language. These journalists are obviously college educated just based on their diction. These articles are eloquently written. They pontificate about the Me Too movement with the power of a manifesto. But it's clear these journalists spend more time focusing on their words than focusing on their facts. We would be better served if they were poets instead of journalists. They don't reference how Moses corroborated Soon-Yi's story. They don't look at the source material from the custody battle. They don't interview the witnesses or the investigators. They don't look for patterns of abuse in Mia's home, or point out the fact that false allegations often arise during custody battles. They attack Daphne Merkin for being biased, but they don't attack Maureen Orth's more egregious bias. They use ad hominems like creepy, bad woman. They say loyal instead of logical. They call Soon-Yi a puppet. We tread lightly when we think of Dylan's account. Even the few people who disagree with her attacks on Woody don't attack Dylan personally. Scarlett Johansson said she would work with Woody again. Kate Blanchett said she believes in due process. They are careful not to say Dylan was a puppet or that her account can be ignored. They don't attack her mental faculties or her memory. We treat Dylan's words seriously, as we should, and we avoid ad hominems. But we trample all over Soon-Yi, not just her account, but her character as a person, and we don't criticize her for her behavior, but for her association. Nearly 30 years later, and little has changed. We continue to ignore the possibility of abuse by Mia Farrow and the deaths of these adopted Asian children. Soon-Yi and Moses' accounts are disparaged and ignored by nearly every journalist who wrote about this story. I wasn't surprised by this treatment for reasons I already mentioned, but Daphne Merkin was surprised by the level of vitriol aimed at the article. She writes, "It's strange how critics don't think Soon-Yi deserves to be heard, that the abuse she suffered because it was at the hands of a woman and not a man is somehow less valid. I think the attacks on it are sexist and more than a tad racist." Now, to be fair, most of these journalists don't actually try to silence Soon-Yi. There's a difference between disparaging, ignoring, and outright silencing. Silencing is when you actively try to stop someone's words from even being published, which we should never do if you believe in a free press. However, there was one journalist who actually tried to silence Soon-Yi. There was one journalist who tried to catch and kill her story before it was published. Ronan Farrow. Ronan called the editor-in-chief of New York Magazine to kill this story. Emails also came from lawyers, so there was a real threat of a lawsuit. Merkin writes, "I wasn't used to this level of fear of Ronan, of being sued, of the power of Mia and Ronan, simply culturally, their power on Twitter." Let's get the facts straight. Ronan, a self-proclaimed advocate for victims, and a self-proclaimed defender of the free press.
We should have the free press in this country. Reporters shouldn't be threatened.
Tried to kill the story from a victim of abuse. When he couldn't stop it from being published, he went on to disparage it. As a journalist, I'm shocked by the lack of care for the facts, the refusal to include eyewitness testimony that would contradict falsehoods in this piece, and the failure to print my sister's responses. Okay, so let's think about that. In the Gayle King interview with Dylan, there was no close review of the facts. Gayle King also doesn't interview other eyewitnesses. In the 2013 Vanity Fair article, where Dylan makes her accusations, Neither Soon Yi or Moses were interviewed, nor were any of the original witnesses from the custody trial who contradict Mia's narrative. Lark and Tam's death was also never investigated. Ronan was a journalist by 2013. Where was Ronan's journalistic integrity then? Where was his shock by the lack of care for the facts? Where was his need to present both sides? I do agree with Ronan on one point. He says survivors of abuse deserve better. He is right. Soon Yi and Moses deserve better.